All right, it's time to do some Content Hub today, folks in Mumbai. Hello to everyone and everyone else from the rest of the world. And thank you for being here and attending my session today. Um, so in our community, past couple of years, we've been hearing a lot about Content Hub and its features. And I'm presenting today to all of you to share knowledge on and what it takes to become a Content Hub developer and get you ready when we are thrown into a future headless world in the modern and broader digital experience platform world, not just siloed into experience platform anymore, right? Because we have a huge omni-channel where we can implement our solutions in a broader digital experience platform. Just to begin with, I went to my next slide. Okay, it did. All right, just to begin with a quick introduction of myself. I am Venu Vustipalli, based out of Texas, USA, a solution architect at PK, a Sitecore platinum partner specialized in XP and Content Hub. Just a little bit about my background. With over 15 years of experience in many web content management systems throughout most of my career. I was introduced to Sitecore roughly 7 years ago, and then since then, I found my passion in Sitecore to coming up with solutions to problems, and most importantly, I enjoy in helping both technical and non-technical sides of the business understand the processes and pass to the next generation of the digital experiences. So that's my background, and with that, let's look at today's agenda. Like I mentioned, firstly, a quick overview on Content Hub, just to refresh our understanding on what it exactly is. Then we look at the personas or roles that use the system on a daily basis. And then the components, this is the most important thing that we need to understand before we do any customizations to Content Hub. The components that we need to focus in the system as a developer. That leads to the tools, right? So now we looked at the components. We're going to look at some of the tools that are available in the system to customize the components discussed, and then followed by demos. That's the most important fun stuff. And I promise I will try to get to the demos as quickly as possible, but I just want to make you understand the components and where we can customize before we get there. So I'll be demoing most of those tools, if not all of them, because I haven't used a couple of them myself yet. So I will demo some use cases so that you can use them appropriately and as a starting point to solution your business requirements when it comes to your projects. Then we'll have some QA session to finish it up, and then I definitely promise I will do my best to maintain simplicity so that you can understand it easily. So, so here is the famous picture that's presented in many Content Hub sessions, if you haven't seen it already. And what is Content Hub? Just a quick overview. The name itself is self-explanatory, right? It's a hub of all content that is aggregated from different source systems. So for example, like you see on the left side on the slide, any organization has most of these source systems in their enterprise ecosystems. And like, for example, legacy platforms, file servers, mobile device management, product lifecycle management, supplier agency, etc., etc. But Content Hub stores all this content in one place. Right? It's like a one-stop shop, so that can be consumed by various systems in an omni-channel world. Like you can use any CMSs, not just Sitecore XP, can be anything, or an e-commerce or any social channel or point of sales on the right side that you can see in this slide. So these can be either for publishing or make it available for customers or for and analysis perspective. So the main goal of Content Hub is to solve content crisis. What it means is marketing team has some common challenges in the past, and even now in most of the organizations they do, they run into. So for example, managing content in multiple channels, that's the most common challenge, such as websites, social media pages, blogs, they maintain all this stuff in different channels. And it is also a challenge to any IT team to architect and build systems and tools that can manage this content lying around in different places, right? So that's one challenge. And another challenge is time and quality to deliver content hugely depends on the way it's produced and maintained in different systems, right? So everything takes time. So for example, marketing team works with a third-party agency to get some graphical content or publish some graphical content to the channels. So to bring everything into the system, it takes time. That's one of the biggest challenges. Not just that, one of the other challenges is making sure the content that exists in all systems is personalized to provide relevant experience to the customers to make them come back, right? So you have content. So right now, as Sitecore developers, we know about XP and we are personalizing content in Sitecore XP. But what about the content that's lying around in different systems, right? So if you bring all of them into Content Hub, then we can have the consistent personalization that we can deliver to our customers. That will improve the business and as well as make them come back. So Content Hub provides a way to solve, this content crisis by providing ability to, manage, collaborate, and publish content in one place, and then makes everyone's life easier, by doing that. So you might have heard so many acronyms such as DAM, CMP, MRM, and PCM, and WP. So when I heard them first of all, like, oh wow, what are these? And DAM, you might, maybe most familiar to every one of you, is the digital asset management. And Content Hub is not just DAM, and it also has CMP, content marketing platform, which allows marketing team to effectively plan and manage and collaborate, right? So like one of the challenges that I mentioned previously is time to create and deliver, and time to create and deliver content quickly to various channels. So that was one of the challenge, and CMP is there to help with that. And MRM, marketing resource management, and that's a platform that meets all the marketing resource management needs. PCM is product content management. It centralizes and automates all the product data to feed into the e-commerce websites, print catalogs, or ERP systems and more. And web to print, WP stands for the web to print, right? A platform that simplifies and automates for graphical content. So these are all the products that Content Hub comprises, and that's Content Hub in a nutshell, right? And you might have heard most of this already, and otherwise, this is the introduction, a quick overview. That takes us to the personas or the roles. Now let's look at what are all the roles that use Content Hub and its products, right? So typically the first role is user, and these are marketing users, who can manage, publish content, and collaborate with their team. They can create, upload assets, review, submit assets, in the workflow. There is already out of the box workflow available, right? Once they create assets, there is a property called final life cycle status, that gives the status of that asset being uploaded, like it's being submitted, and to the create state and under review state and rejected state, blah blah blah. And the users can also annotate and comment on the digital assets to collaborate with their team, right? They can also search. And second role is the admin role. This role is kind of more advanced user who can manage data models, pages, branding, like they can theme the Content Hub pages and the whole site itself. And security, right, meaning they can manage users and user groups and provide appropriate permissions. And they can also set up reports as well. Like, for example, user adoptions, right? Like how many users are logging into the system, successfully logged into the system. Or another example, they can create a report page which displays asset statistics, right? Like with different types of assets in a bar chart or a pie chart. Okay, these are all different types of assets. So they can create all the reports too. So they're a little more advanced users. And the third one is dev role, and which is what we mainly focus in here in this presentation, and who can customize various components of the system, such as data components, structure components, extension components, and cloud components, which are we're going to take a look at it in a bit. I'm not going to go over general user and admin activities mentioned here, because this presentation is mainly focused on developer activities. So usually developer role pretty much knows full functionality of the system, right? And then some of the responsibilities overlap with admin role as well, especially like when we define data models during requirements gathering phase and creating taxonomies, schema definitions, and DRM contracts, etc., etc. So these are all three main roles that are in Content Hub system. And a typical learning path for you, if you're starting fresh, would be from user to admin to dev, basically, right? Then just likewise in XP, even though you become a developer, you might not have looked into all the features of the Content Hub because this is a pre-built product, right? And it's a huge one, and then it has a lot of user functionality, right, that the user can do. So you can, but as long as you know the main components that we're going to discuss now, then you will know where to customize the user experience based on that. So this presentation should give you all that. So the training path, like I said, you would basically do Content Hub fundamentals training. That's free, I think, available, right, in learning.sitecore.com. And then you do Content Hub professional mock DAM implementation. So it's like 4 days course right now. I think it used to be 5 days, and then they bring it down to 4 days with the instructional-led training, and then followed by enterprise training. So 3 trainings basically. And then first one is closed book, open book assessment they do. After that, professional mock DAM implementation training. Then the enterprise training is closed book. So after completing all this, you get certified. And we also have individual Content Hub developer certification exam introduced a couple of months back to get certified. So that's about roles and learning path if you're starting fresh. Not changing. Next slide. Types of components. All right. So let's dive into what are all different types of components in CH that a developer needs to be aware of. So the terminology here, components, when I mean by the components here, meaning that it's not like a section of a page that normally a Sitecore XP developer usually build, but it means that a specific area of Content Hub and these components act as a main building blocks to run a Content Hub instance. So Content Hub that pretty much works on 4 types of components: data components, structure components, extension components, and cloud components. While it's important that Content Hub developer understands the functionality of these components, right? And they should also be able to customize each one of them, right? That's the target that matches with their business requirements. So each client has different business requirements. So we just go to the appropriate component and make the customization. So you're meaning that in typical world, right, a Sitecore partner the Content Hub specialization team along with Sitecore Content Hub team. Initially, Sitecore Content Hub team is involved to support partners by providing frameworks and processes for a successful Content Hub implementation. Initially, they also train appropriate clients marketing team resources, as they will be the ones who will be primarily using Content Hub system once it's set up and playing user and maybe admin roles, because the developer usually have overlapped responsibilities with admin. So they will train client personas too. So now let's dig a little deeper to understand each of these components where dev can customize the functionality. First up, data components. It consists of main data in a Content Hub. So example, photos, videos, right? If you take the DAM module on documents and blogs, or it can be anything, right? From the CMP, along with their associated properties and relationships. So properties and relationships in a data is the main concept of these data components. So that brings up an important component, right, into the topic here, which is entity. So an entity in the world of Sitecore Content Hub is a set of data that belongs together as one piece of content. Like example, a product or a campaign or a recipe, right, or a file, etc., etc. So the typical rule is anything that you can, find and display as a result when searching for that piece of content is a candidate for an entity. So it's like Content Hub is pretty much everything is in, all piece of content is in entity, right? And maybe 80% of it. Sorry, let me go back. So the typical rule is like anything you can see or display as a result, right, of searching. So if you're familiar with a database, entity relationships and models and diagrams that you've seen, these entities are very similar. So in Content Hub world, we have a system, right, with most of these are defined already. So we're not building, defining these from scratch. So we have already some of them available. So we go and end up either tweaking them or create our own, definitions and schema, depending upon, how it suits to our client's business. So generally in the design phase, right, when we define in the data model, so data model like in the, ER diagram or ER model in DB1, right, we use some templates provided by a Sitecore Content Hub team, like they provide some spreadsheets and documentation, and fill in that information, to achieve that process, right? That gives us information to decide on what are all the out-of-the-box properties and relationships that we don't have to touch, and what we need to customize based on that spreadsheet for that specific client. Especially, when you talk about the entity, like I said, it's all about properties and relationships. So properties, and relationships, we come up with a list of them based on the source system properties and relationships. So that's about the data components in Content Hub. And next up is structure components. And these are components, kind of a glue to connect and form relationships among data, right? Data is nothing but entities like we discussed in the data, previous components. So like I see here, there are like 4 main elements in here, like entity definitions. Like entity definition, nothing but it's a definition for an entity is created, right? So when that definition will consist of properties, it can consist relationships to other definitions, right? Or it can consist relationships to taxonomies that we define. And taxonomy, like we heard in our XP wall, taxonomy could be the same thing, right? We define the taxonomy, and then we have the specific metadata, right? And then taxonomy is nothing but, you have more hierarchical values, right, in its tree structure. And option list is kind of similar to the taxonomies, but it's a flat list of, items in there. It doesn't have any complicated hierarchical values or any other criteria that drives it. So the main difference between taxonomies and optional list, the way that you pick them when you create those properties is like if you need do you need hierarchical values, first case. And then if you don't need hierarchical, you end up with optional list. Do you need security, right? If you, let's say some properties you need to show and then, you know, make them as a secure, not show to some users, right? Then you would end up as a taxonomy. So you go through a couple of rules, right, and then create them. And then fourth one is portal pages. Portal pages, like it says, it's a UI component. So we have pages in Content Hub, so we can customize them. And we have real page components here, right? So it's a different now terminology page component, I'm saying, which is exactly similar to the XP page components that we develop usually. So we have page components here, but you're restricted. We can't just create any components and then tag it into the Content Hub page. We only have one way to create those components or customized components, which I'm going to show in the demos today. So that brings up to the third component type, which is extension components. That has this is the main important one because it talks about most of the tools that we're going to be using in the demos for the developers. So extension components mean like we can extend, the Content Hub components, right? So here, like I mentioned, external page components. External page components are extensible components where you can have your own, custom libraries or that you can add into the page. It's mostly related to the front end development because the code will be JavaScript and Ajax and jQuery, and then put your HTML under the template. And the triggers and actions, they work together because the trigger is a set of actions that are automatically executed after specific events and under specific conditions as well. So you have it's going to trigger's going to trigger the action, and that action is going to execute some of the scripts that we write, right? So they work together. And REST API is it's a hypermedia API built on top of the HTTP, and it's a standard HTTP. It requests and have the basic verbs, and they accept all the standard verbs and response codes. And web SDK client is mostly used by outside code because we are .NET C# developers, and then this web client SDK gives us the that support so that the developers can implement their own logic, and to manipulate the objects and resource in the Content Hub. So you connect by using web SDK client to your Content Hub instance, mostly to perform any entity operations. So the fourth one, cloud components, logic apps and Azure functions, right? So there are two main components in this cloud components, and these are all Azure cloud services managed in Azure platform. For example, just a use case, if you have data flying in external cloud or on-prem systems, you can use these tools, right, to set up an automated and schedule workflows to migrate or refresh data in Content Hub instance based on some triggers. So this is external components. So that's pretty much about the components, right, that we have access to Content Hub and where we can customize. So we explored the areas of Content Hub so far, and where we have an opportunity to customize those components. And here's the tools that are available to achieve that, right? And mainly divided into two categories: internal and external. Excuse me. So first, internal ones. If you look at the internal ones, scripts, actions, triggers, and external components. 4 tools. We talked about actions, triggers, and external components in SDK and STP in the data extension components earlier. So the theoretical part is the same thing, but these are just the naming part of the tools that are available in Content Hub. But scripts is the new one here. So internally in Content Hub instance, we have we have a user interface, right, where we can write and build scripts, which I'm going to show in a bit. Not very intuitive, but it's very powerful when combined with other tools like triggers and actions. So even in some cases with external components. And so all scripts in Sitecore are restricted and with some parameter libraries. So you can add your custom libraries into it. So if triggers, actions, external components, Web SDK, we briefly looked into these areas in extension components, the theoretical part, but I'll be demoing on each of these tools in a short moment. That means we are very close to the fun stuff. So finally, the data theoretical part is over. So let me quickly talk through the other tools that are mentioned here. CLI, the command line interface, is used for communicating with Sitecore content hub instance through REST API and using the C# Web SDK. But at this point, I haven't used this tool much yet. And this is a preview release to enable customers and partners to provide feedback, before they are even finalized, right? So I think this will be in a good use case in DevOps process where we can sync content hub instances in different environments and run, create our own commands, CLI commands, and then run the DevOps commands to sync the content, right? Things of that nature. Package import and export. Sitecore Content Hub offers an import-export package feature that allows you to migrate structural changes between instances. It can literally create everything into zip file containing a collection of JSON files, organized by categories such as like all the entity operation taxonomies, the portal pages, scripts, settings. They all can be packaged up and then migrated. We also have a couple of other tools which I didn't mention here, like Client SDK and JavaScript SDK. Client SDK recently added into the Content Hub, but it's a wrapper on top of the SDK client. But I'm not covering that one because it just recently should have played around with it. JavaScript SDK, same thing, I haven't played around with it. But most importantly, things that we should be knowing initially are Web SDK client. And if you're not a .NET developer, of course, or your organization don't have a skill set around the .NET developing skill set, then REST API they can use in their implementation. With that, okay, so that's the theoretical part. So now, demo. So let me start demo and bring up my instance. So this is my Content Hub instance, and I'm going to quickly demo some of the components I explained in the previous slides. First one, the data components. We talked about entities and asset entities, but like I said, entities is just like most of the, maybe 80% of the items in Content Hub are entities, excuse me. So, for example, asset entities, right? If I go to the asset section here, and before I even go there, like you see the top navigation here, it's a combination of all the modules that we discussed, and assets, collections, create, review. These are all part of DAM module. Products is PCM module, and content is CMP module, and DRM, and there's a manage section for admin places, right? And projects, this is the MRM module. But we're mostly looking at the DAM part of it to see what customization we can make. So like you see here, these are some sample assets that we have, just for the demo perspective. And it's just, this is the assets page where we have only approved assets. And review page will have the assets that are in review status, and create page, will have the recently uploaded assets. So if I go to some example asset, this is the asset details, right? Where you can see, like I said, this is an entity, right? Nothing but an entity. which is created based on entity definition asset, right? asset entity. So I'm gonna show you the entity definition in a bit, but this is UI perspective. You see this asset entity on a details page with all the properties that I mentioned in the data components, right? Properties. I have some custom properties that I created or custom based on the custom taxonomy, and some system properties. And there's some relations, right? Relations are nothing but, the taxonomies, final life cycle status, and all that. So this is a details page. So because I'm talking about the relations and properties, let me take you to the asset manage page. Just duplicate it. Go to settings, which is the main area for the admins to look at what they can customize. But in this case, okay, so we're talking about the entity definition. So we go to schema. So that's where all the definitions are. And if you look at the asset entity definition, we can see all the properties and relationships that are defined in here. So if you end up having a custom entity definition, this is where you end up creating it in the schema section, and then have all your relations and properties defined. And in this case, I have some custom taxonomy defined as asset source, right? If I go to manage section, click once more, and go to, let me take you to the taxonomy place. Since this is zoomed in, I'm finding a little hard time to find the one I needed, but for that purpose, you also have search. So you can search and go to taxonomy, excuse me. And like I said, I have a custom taxonomy element created, for example. So we're just having a prefix in FL because this is just a sample demo and like a fruitful. This is most of the mock trainings, that kind of help people, do is on the fruitful, this content, right? That's why the company name is fruitful. All these definitions or entities that start with M dot, meaning that they're out of the box and defined in the content hub. And whenever we are customizing and creating our own stuff, it's always good practice to follow with our own company branding prefix. So if we go inside the content security taxonomy, you can see we have internal not restricted, restricted 3 child elements under this taxonomy. So just one example, this is how we, admins usually create at the beginning of the project, taxonomies and what can be option lists and blah, blah, blah. If I go back to so we talked about taxonomy component, and we talked about entity definition and option list is another place. Like I said, a flat list can be defined. Like for example, for this project, we had the social media and a couple of flat list items list created. So that's about the option list. Option lists are better, if you don't have any hierarchical values, and with a couple of other criteria that I mentioned earlier. And what else did we discuss? Pages. Okay, this is the UI elements, right? So if you go to pages, literally all these top, pages, they're all, and a couple of other places where we do math edits and another type of functionality for users, they're all in here. So we can literally customize edit pretty much everything. So if I, for example, we've been to asset details page here, right? This is the asset details page. If you go there, like you see here, these are all the components that exist on this page. And the most important one that, we will be focusing is the middle section here, to customize something in here, there in one of the demos. And that's how we add the components here. But I will come back to this during that demo. So you can pretty much add your components here, but the only catch here is you cannot create any component that you want in your in this Content Hub instance and then add it here, right? So when you're adding components, There's some out-of-the-box, component templates available, so you have to use that one. And the only template that we can use is to, using the external component that I'm going to be demoing pretty soon. So that should cover an overview of just the Content Hub instance, and which should bring to the first tool that I will be demoing, REST API. So you can use your favorite API client to access these endpoints in the Content Hub. So let me bring up my client, Postman, in this case. Okay, before I even go there, let me quickly show one important thing. So we have an endpoint. If I go to, let me close on this quickly. So we have an endpoint called, it's an API, I think this API, right? So we have status endpoint, which is basically displays. Okay, so we can access all these endpoints in the browser. Okay. And then you can see all the information in JSON output. So this endpoint doesn't require any authentication, right? And like you see the asset details of this entity, you can also look at this asset details, by going into the endpoint that they provide, entities / in the browser, you can see the ID of this entity. In this case, it's 01630, so I just copy over here. And then go to the details of this entity. This page is very useful for the developers, right? Because it displays all the properties and the relationships that are defined in the schema and the taxonomies and everything. So they're all displayed and useful when you're coding, right? So you can see, okay, what are the relationships and what are the properties in this that you can access through code. There's another way to check, right? The stuff of the entity ID, and going into the entities client. So if I go back to my Postman, like I said, the status endpoint, you don't need any authentication. So if you run this, you should get the same JSON response that you saw on the browser earlier. So the data is sent and received as a JSON, basically. So most of the standard HTTP webs like asset supported, get, post, put, delete, they all supported, and it uses standard HTTP headers for requests and replies. And a couple of important ones are application JSON, right? So you can only do application JSON into your request, post in your request, and there is a XAuth. So any other endpoints that if you're accessing from your client or your other programming code, you have to use authentication. Typically, you would have OAuth client created and then have tokens created based on that username and password. But just for the demo perspective, I have an XAuth token, that can connect to the Content Hub instance to perform any entity operations. But this endpoint, basically, if you run this, it's gonna generate a key, which I don't want to show it here, but I have it. I have the token already. Just to test the token, of course, obviously, you basically add this. I'm not showing the token because it's security, but you add this header, right? And then if you have any JSON data that you want to post, you can post it, but this endpoint doesn't require any. And then, if you check, this endpoint returns the jobs that are running, right, on this Content Hub instance. That's one example. And if I go to entity, it's one of the sample, right? When I ran one example earlier on the browser to see the properties and relationships of that, so similar thing. We have using the Postman client here, I'm running the same thing, and then you get the same data that we saw in the browser, like properties and relationships for this entity. So these are you access the entities. There is one more endpoint, like entity definitions, right? This is all. Let's say if you want to see all entities that exist in the Content Hub, you can access all entities by using this type of entity, right? And if you see how many, like there are 157 items in total. If I move on to the next one, like let's say if you want to do some CRUD operations in your other application, right? With other programming and using the REST API. This is like you always send the body with properties and file name and blah, blah. How do you know about this? Like exactly the one I showed you, the details page of an entity, right? Or you can grab, this entity example, right? So this is this data. This is where you know. So right now, I'm going into properties. I'm going into properties and changing the file name, right? That I want to change for that. So file name property. So because I know this by going into the details page in the browser or in the Postman client, I can perform the operations, the CRUD operations here. Entity definition, it's an ML set. It's always good to have this relation in there so that when you perform the any CRUD operations, it'll be easier for you to understand. So if I run this, let's say I have this entity in the content hub instance, right? So if I go to this entity, right? Or I can even show you the UI of that, right? So that's the JSON output, and this is the UI, and this is orange tree, right? That's what we have there. So if we go back to our Postman, and then let's say, well, okay, whatever we want to do, right? Just go to 3. In this case, and then run this, and I'm doing CRUD operation. I'm just updating an entity in this case. And if I go back to zip file, we shape 1 to 3. So that's how you perform the CRUD operations using Postman, or you can use in any of your external programs. And there's also another endpoint, query endpoint, where you can query the entities in your content system. But in this case, for example, all the asset entities, right? So all the assets, because we are more concerned about the asset entities, so we have a definition name using the asset. So all the assets are grabbed by this query, right? Definition name is m.asset and created by just the ID of my user in the content hub system. And then you can see if you run this query endpoint, then you basically get all the items that are created by me, right? Most of them created by me in this instance. So that's one endpoint, and you can also perform the full text search, right? You can see orange text wherever it appears in the query. This is one example. Relationships, right? If you have any relationships, you want to search a query based on that relationships. Let's say, for example, if it has content security exists, right? And that's the kind of custom taxonomy, right? If it does have it, displays all that query. So this is how, just showing different examples that you can run using the query endpoint, right? And like you see in this example, you have all the assets, by definition name m.asset and asset type asset. This relationship, right, is, I think this is the backdrop asset type, right? That's the ID. We are seeing IDs up here is because these are relationships, right? So these relationships are kind of taxonomies, and you won't know the exact name of it until you get inside into the details of the entity definition. So file level stake is lifecycle status is nothing but approved or review, whatever that ID that could be. So you can use, in this case, backdrop assets, I guess, and this is asset type, and then 543 is just a review status of that. Whatever the entities that are in the review status, and backdrop asset type equals to backdrop asset types. That returns all the entities, and you can use this entity information and do whatever we want in your front-end code or any other application. Very much used by the other developers. Okay? And also we also have search endpoint, which is a little more friendly than the query. We only use it if we know that the results are kind of limited, right? I mean, if the results have more, and then for performance reasons, we always obviously create a query, right? This is how we just create a query, and then filter it, and then just do this, search based on the tree. The title contains tree, right? Wherever we have tree, just return that. right? And we have, see some items returned with tree. So if I minimize this, some of them have some values of tree. So next, search. You can also do the search. This is how you create your full text search using the search endpoint, and then wherever you have orange, you can just receive that type of data. And you can also search by query, query ID, facet ID. Facet ID is nothing but, if we go back to quickly go back to my assets page, these are all the facets we have, right, for the search. And for example, if I go to vendor facet, like you can see, this is the ID of that query for this facet when you're running that search. We can also use this ID to run and receive the data. In this case, you can see 19 are received, and if you go back to here, you have 19 here. So that's all mostly about the Postman, and then I'm going to come back to the script execution a little later because it's a little more advanced, and it's tied with other tools too. So I'm going to come back to that. So that's REST API, and just to talk about some of the best practices. And when you're implementing this REST API, always establish a retry after logic, right? When you use the API, you can run into too many requests, and then the one thing is to have the retry logic, and then have group your requests into batches and take action, when you receive too many request response. And another best practice is to create dedicated API users. Dedicated API users for each integration to detect which one is overloading the platform or generating errors, basically, right? So that's why it's always good to have separate API users for your different, REST API endpoints that you access for different source systems or destination target systems. So that covers the REST API part of it for all the non.NET developers. So with that, let's move on to the next tool, external component. External components allow you to integrate external libraries, like I said, when we're talking about the extension components. Right? So you integrate external libraries within Sitecore Content Hub page components, right? And this provides, so you can enter your external libraries and configure into this component, and then perform any actions or events. Based on some events, you can show and display HTML and inject into the DOM. So with that, let's go. Let me go back to my Content Hub instance, and for example, so we have asset details page. So if I go to pages, like I mentioned, like I showed you here earlier. So if I go to asset details page, because that's the page that we're trying to add something in here. On this page, if you add some components, right? There are a couple of components I added just for demo. I mean, basically you would add them by choosing the external component, right? And then add it by selecting here. But the properties I'm going to show you, for this. So if I go to this component, for example, it has a couple of tabs. You configure it by creating a name, but any properties that you want to configure, but we don't have any in this case. But this is how you add your external library. If you're a front-end developer, right, you can have your Ajax and other external libraries added into this component like this, and then you will have your code, referencing to that library, and this simple, pretty much, this simple code pretty much doing subscribing to the. These are all in the API documentation available, and it's subscribing to the entity loaded and performing the entity save event. When the entity save event is happening, you are trying to inject something into this container in HTML. So that all that HTML resides under the template tab. And like you see, this is the place where you inject HTML, with some, wherever that condition, is met. So in this case, I'm just updating the description, when you change in the title of the component. So messages tab is for translations and other messages which you don't, need to use in this case. So add this component. Okay, how do we enable this? Because they're all hidden right now on that page. So I can go to the settings and make it visible. And go to this page and reload. And you can see the external component, which is using our external libraries. And then in this case, right now it's showing just the description, right? And it has some code in there. So let's say if I change the description, okay, testing, external component, whatever, and then you change based on the segment, right? And it updates that component with that information. So that's how that's a pretty basic, use case where you can, add your custom component code in here and, display it on the page, component. So if I go to little more advanced use case, right? If I hide this one, that's how I hide it. And this one is hidden, so I'm going to make it visible. And then save. And in this use case, I'm displaying all the related assets, that are related to this, kind of entity. So I'm just showing all the related assets that have some specific criteria using REST API, doing the query, and then displaying all these links. I'm going to show the code in a bit, but so this is a functionality. It's like, okay, it shows all the links, right? Related links based on some REST API code. So if I go inside the code of this, I don't have any external libraries. Sample code just written everything in here in this component. Pretty much basically similar to the previous one. You subscribe to that entity and you perform your events and conditions or whatever you want to do. In this case, I'm running the REST API, using the REST API to receive the items by entities for all the assets and full text, like where the fruit is matching with any entities. Then I'm just using all those entities and displaying in this related assets section of the page. So, and the DOM, this is where it's being injected, all the links, from the code. So there's one use case you could think of, and if users ask you to customize on this page or anything, you can play around with it like that. So that should pretty much cover about the external components. And if we go back to my presentation, next one is Web Client SDK. This is the most used tool for the Sitecore developers because it's predominantly .NET based, and we can use our C# coding in there. So we have new SDK introduced since version 3.0, so that code can be used in two different types of SDKs here. We have Web Client SDK and Scripting SDK. So Scripting SDK I'm going to show right after this tool. So that's another tool, right? Scripts, triggers, actions that I mentioned earlier in the tool set. But let me finish with the Web Client SDK, and then I will show that one. So we will dive into scripting a little later. You can use this Web Client SDK by adding, NuGet packages that are mentioned in the documentation. So if I go to my Web Client SDK app, so this is how. So I created. We can create two different things. This SDK in two different places. One is using our favorite IDE and then create our project in Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code or Azure function, apps too. But in this case, I chose Visual Studio. Like you see here, we add our NuGet packages first, and then once you add it, it has a couple of helper classes to connect to the Content Hub. pretty much basically client class, has client instance here, which is using the web client interface, right, to connect to the by using the OAuth password grant. We also have another type of grant, which is token grant, if you want to use it. But in this case, I used the OAuth password grant, and which is using the app settings that are defined. So in this app settings, I have the client and the instance host name and the web client that I created in the calendar instance. So if I go back to my instance and quickly go to the manage area of the instance and OAuth, I can't find it because this is zoomed in. That's why I have research. OAuth clients, and I just created some custom client that I can use it and to connect to my web SDK client, and client secret that's in there, and then username password. My username password, I'm just showing. I got everything added into the environment variable so that I don't have to show all the secret stuff to you. So once the client instance is created, so I'm using that client instance to connect to Content Hub instance. And in this program, pretty much I have just a basic use case to do some CRUD operations. In this case, read operations. I have a synchronous, task, main task here running that pretty much has some basic logging, minimal logging at this point, and checking the connection, the client that's created, right, in our other helper class, checking whether the connection is successful first, and then running another task to run to receive all the entities, backdrop asset type entities. In this use case, backdrop is one asset type that I have as a property in my entity definition. So if I go to backdrop task, you can see we can run it's very much the link query, as you're aware of in our XP world, right? You can run the link queries and using the where condition where the definition name is m.asset, and then I also have a couple of other criteria here, like this is the backdrop asset type, and this is the approved status. So all the assets that are backdrops and then approved in this query, and give me all those entities, right? So I'm returning those entities through this task. And this is the REST API equivalent that we discussed earlier. So by using the query endpoint, we can also grab the same result items in JSON format using the REST API client. But this is the link way and our web SDK client way. So while returning the results, I'm trying to resolve all the properties and relationship information because I have to do some tweaking with those, right? That's why I want all of them. And that's what the full is doing here, returning all the properties and relationships for all those entities so that I can play around with them. So the query results gives me all the entities that I need. And basically I'm just doing a count showing how many in there. And then for each entity that I received, I just want, in this operation, I'm just reading them and then displaying the title and then content security. I have two different types of entities, properties that I'm displaying just for the sake of the demo. One is the title, straightforward property in the JSON, which is the get property value. Straightforwardly you can get it from the entity details. And then other one is content security, custom taxonomy that I created, right? I want to get the value of that too. But that's not straightforward because it's not a straightforward property in the details, right? So if I go back to my Content Hub browser, and like I showed, this is the useful fit for the developers. And like you see all the details, properties and relationship, right? So content security is somewhere there in the relationships, not in the properties. So you can't access this directly and easily. So that if I search for content security, this is where the relationship is defined, right? So this is under the relationship. So to access that, we need to know what's the relationship, and then and what's the type of that, and then we go and grab that information. So for that perspective, this code helps to achieve that. Going to the parent relationship, we grab the relationship first, and from that relationship, go to that taxonomy, and then in the taxonomy, get the label of that. Okay, taxonomy label. What is that? Give me that. So in this CRUD operation, just doing the read operation, you can do whatever you want, read or update or anything based on your requirement. Let me run this console app. So if I run this console app, it gives us all the. Oh, sorry, yeah. So we're almost done. Yeah, this is kind of last tool. So I think we ran over the time. Sorry about that. Not even checking the time. Presentation showing, not showing any time here. Sorry. Okay, so if I run this thing, it just goes. It shows me all the asset count and then title and kind of security, right? There's the restricted interval and blah blah blah, and that's pretty much it. So this is the tool that we use to do all that entity operations. So if I go to the best practice of this, use this web SDK, just for the sake of, it has inbuilt retry. Right? That's why rather than REST API, it's better to use the web SDK client so that you can customize that. And wherever you have the migration activities to import and import and doing the CRUD operations, use this. And when working with Azure functions, use that helper class that I showed you, so that you don't have to keep creating instances in different places. So okay, since we almost ran out of time, okay, this is the last one that I wanted to show you quickly. If I go back to my instance, the place that we usually create scripts are here under the scripts, and then another tab just to show that the example that we have. This is one example. We create a script basically in here, and all these scripts are restricted, right? You can't import any of your custom libraries here into this interface. You have to use the ones that are your only allowed to, right? So you just add this, and then in here you access the context properties and then client, and there are helper properties that you can use. In this case, if an asset is rejected, I'm just sending an email, creating an email template, and then sending that email notification to all the users based on user groups and blah blah blah, and then sending the emails to that user specific groups. But you can trigger these scripts by using triggers, right? So triggers basically based on some triggers you can trigger some actions. So in these triggers we have, okay, whenever you're triggering this, when your entity is modified. So let's say asset is modified, you trigger that. And what condition? Okay, approved status when something is changed, and when something is rejected. So I have these conditions defined. When something is rejected, I'm sending trigger this action, which is action type rejected. So if I go back to, so these all three work together, scripts, triggers, and actions. So if you go to actions, just quickly show you, this is a rejected action that I created, right? If I edit this quickly, it just shows that what is the script that is, type of script that is attached, and then script type is, and script that we are attaching is asset rejected. So this asset rejected script is triggered using the trigger and action. The event is based on some conditions, right? And modification, and then based on these final lifecycle status, and this action, triggering this asset. So when an asset is in review status, right? If you go to review status, then if I reject it, then it's gonna send the email to the people who are in that user group that, okay guys, yeah, this asset rejected, go take a look at it. So that's pretty much that's the interface in the Content Hub. So, and then you can make use of that to perform those triggers and actions and scripts one way to do that. So while using this, it's always used in background scripts rather than in process, because it has some performance implications. And in process executes straight away. In background, actually asynchronously does it, and then it has more. It's better. Like I said, I showed you an example email template. Create your own custom email template and notifications, and execute metadata type of script when you are, adding additional metadata, and use your favorite IDE, one using Web Client SDK to create the script first, right? So that you have your IntelliSense and debugging mechanism in your IDE, and then create the script there, and then come back to your user interface in Content Hub to copy paste and then build there and then test it. So that's pretty much it. About all the tools that I showed you, that should give you a kickstart on how to customize all those components. And it's time for the Q&A. And sorry for running over a little bit. I'm totally into this.
No worries. If anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes.
Yeah, actually, I have one question on the scripts. Is there any useful links available to get familiar with the scripts? Because I tried with this, I'm trying with this Content Hub certification, but it is very difficult to find the scripts which I am trying. Is there any useful links available for you to try out this scripts? Any examples to try it out?
So did you check Content Hub documentation style labs? And then they usually give some examples in there, right? And even the scripts that are mentioned in the Web Client SDK, right? Examples, because they use the same mClient object and context. Obviously, it's different properties, but you can use your Web Client SDK local. Yeah, I would recommend you to set up the local project using the Web Client SDK and generate your script and debug it and then make it ready and then copy paste into your UI so that would be easier for you. And they have some examples available for those Web Client SDK this documentation.
Oh, okay. Okay. Can you share those links in the chat or somewhere else?
Yeah, sure.
These links.
Yeah, sure. And then
yeah. Thank you so much.
I'll share it at the end of the presentation. But there is also
share it with me. I'll send it out, Venu.
Yep. And there's also Sitecore Gold, right? Done by Chris Williams and the team, and where we have some sample code, some extra additional sample code that you can use. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Venu, so much.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Hope I made it simple. I'm going to show scripts even more better if we had time, but yeah. Any other questions?
All right. I think we are good.
Cool.
All right.
Thank
Awesome.
you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Venu. Thank you so much for presenting this session for us. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And we're going to be sharing a recording of this session on our channel. And you can probably even get the links off of there from the presentation. So again, thank you, Venu. Right?
Yeah. Thanks again
Thanks,
for
everyone.
scheduling. Thanks again for joining my session today, and thanks for my company to let me use this instance. I hope this presentation helps you all in some way or the other if you're working in any Content Hub project. And it's, believe me, it's easier than what you think. But when you're in there, it's easier. Please feel free to check out my blog, and I have a blog too, which actually starts all the way from the user, and which mostly covers the kind of related content so far. I don't have any other blogs yet. Reach out to me on LinkedIn and Twitter if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer any questions and support you guys. With that, bye for now.
Right. Thank you, everyone. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.